All right, what is up, everybody? Welcome back to another day of SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Wednesday, November 3rd of 2021. The week is just flying by here. Once again, thank you for tuning into the stream, whether you're watching me live here or watching this back as a recording. Appreciate you being here. If you were personally victimized by Cade Cunningham last night, give me a shout out in the YouTube chat. Absolutely sunk all of my lineups. That can happen sometimes. He was out there for like 29 minutes, put up, I think Matt was saying he put up 14 shots or even more than that, went 0 for 9 from 3. I don't know what the exact box score looked like, but basically just had the perfect storm to just crush his salary, right? Crush the value, and then just everything blew up for him. Then the game blows out and the coach takes him out. So just a mess there. But we got Drummond the night before, which was a good play that actually ended up paying off. But Cade Cunningham definitely top of mind today here for anybody reviewing their lineups from last night. We'll go ahead and jump into some questions here in just a moment. I don't have too many questions in my queue here today. I had one question that came in on yesterday's stream right at the start from the Nancy Drew guy, who I know here is a bit of a regular. So let me know if you're here watching today, Nancy Drew guy, that I missed, unfortunately, about changing your slider settings when you're late swapping. So I want to jump back, talk a little bit about that question since I missed it yesterday. We'll jump into that. A couple other questions have come in on Slack over the last couple hours here, so we'll get to those as well. And then a few questions that have come in through YouTube comments as well. So I mentioned yesterday, hold on. First of all, I got to turn off these alerts. I have my alerts set up now that it's NBA season for the NBA lineup alerts channel, and we are clearly simming some games right now, and it is keeps pinging me here. So cool. Now it's done. Yeah. So we got a few questions on YouTube comments, which is pretty cool. People that are watching the videos and commenting after. So we'll talk about some of those questions here today as well. Before we get into it, let me go ahead and pull this up here and mention a couple things. If you weren't here yesterday or missed it, I put out a video on Monday that was me recording my live process of how I built my NFL DFS lineups for Sunday. So that's up here now, building high upside NFL DFS lineups with SaberSim. About an hour long, walking through my full process, how I use SaberSim to build lineups. I recorded that before the Jamal Williams and Calvin Ridley news came out. That definitely changed the slate quite a bit. So a little bit unfortunate that I recorded the whole process before that because I ended up having to redo a lot of it, but still a really good idea to get an idea of what I actually do for an NFL slate every Sunday. And there's already a few comments to that video that I think are some interesting questions. So I always try to reply to those comments on YouTube so that people get their answers. But a few of those I think are pretty interesting. So if we have some time today, talk a little bit about some of those questions on that video. And just published a new video this morning here about contest selection in NBA DFS. So we did a very similar video for NFL at the start of the season, talking about contest selection principles. What are the important things to think about when you're deciding whether or not to play a contest? And then walking through the DraftKings lobby and identifying the best contest to play. This is essentially the exact same video, very similar, but for NBA. So, if you want to hear some of these concepts again, or if you're more focused on NBA and not so much of an NFL player, contest selection is huge, right? You can literally double your ROI, especially if you're playing at the lower stakes, just by getting into the right contests. So highly recommend watching it. I know we had some questions and some requests for this kind of video. I literally went through the DraftKings and FanDuel lobby and contest by contest said, this is the contest I would play first. Then I would add this. Then I would add this. Then I would add this. As your bankroll grows, then start adding this. I talk about here's when I actually think it is contest selection optimal to start playing cash games. Here's where I think it makes sense if you're playing only on DraftKings to incorporate some FanDuel because you can get better contests in there. A lot of questions we get here on stream I tried to tackle in that video. So definitely another good one to watch there as well. Tomorrow, we will be doing a strategy session for this week on NHL DFS. We will have two surprise members of the SaberSim community here, leaving it as a surprise for now, coming on, joining me on stream here tomorrow to talk a little NHL DFS strategy. I'm not a big hockey guy, been wanting to get into it, but I know you guys have been asking for NHL content here, so I wanted to bring a couple experts in here and talk about their NHL strategy. So you will probably recognize their names when they're up here on stream. These guys are in the NHL winner circle on our site. So excited to have them on, talk a little bit about NHL DFS strategy, their process, how to build successful NHL lineups. So anyway, I think that's kind of it for housekeeping. Of course, we'll be right back here again for another office hours on Friday. So 2 p.m. Eastern, open Q&A as we head into the weekend. But that is what we've got going on this week here and tomorrow. But let's go ahead. Let's start jumping into some questions. I see in response to the Cade Cunningham thing, James said, "Oh yeah," and Alex said Cade 100%. Yeah, I think I had 97%. I think it was or 98%. One of my 50 lineups did not have Cade Cunningham. But that happens. I think he was still the right play. So anyway, let's go ahead, pull up the app here, and we'll start getting into some questions here. Let's see. There was a question here that was from Bionic Knee about adjustments to player projections. And it looks like this particular question was intended for an upcoming strategy session where maybe we'll talk a little bit more about making adjustments to NBA projections. So I don't know, Bionic Knee, if you're watching here today, I'm actually literally just I'm going to tag this. I'm going to hold it, and I'm going to talk about this here with Max on one of those upcoming streams. Because again, making adjustments to player projections themselves just isn't a big part of my process. In fact, let me just go ahead. Let me read this question real quick. I'll talk about it briefly here because now I'm already doing it anyway, so I might as well read the question. So he said, question for the upcoming NBA process session regarding player projection adjustments. How often are you reviewing manual adjustments made as the slate progresses? Given how much can particularly change with NBA as news and lineups come out? For further context, let's assume that pre-lock you've identified a handful of player projection updates versus SaberSim. Boost the projections a few points. Some of those updates are for players in the later game. As the slate progresses, some substantial news comes out, new sims are triggered, and now plan to leverage late swap. A quick review shows that the SaberSim projection has now caught up or even exceeded the adjustments previously made. Prior to running late swap, would you just reset the MyProj to match SaberSim Proj? Or given that SaberSim has confirmed the bias on the projection move, would you further boost the My projection up to nudge late swap more to what was identified as a good play? Or would you just do nothing and roll out late swap given the edge it already has, and vice versa if it lowered a player projection? Yeah, this is complicated, right? And I think actually this is honestly why this is a big part of the reason why I have a very light touch with adjusting player projections at all in NBA is because the news is going to break and change the slate so quickly that it's difficult you can spend maybe an hour going into the slate and doing some well-intentioned research and making adjustments to some player projections. But when that late news breaks and maybe you've only got 15 minutes to kind of readjust, it's really hard to know, right? Are my player projections still accurate? Should I just clear them out and roll with what is SaberSim now has? Should I make the equivalent adjustment? Say you bumped up a player by 5 points and that player's projection is now risen to your actual custom projection, right? Do you now bump it again by another 5 or what do you do? Again, I think is a really good question. I'm very excited to hear what Max thinks about this because I know this is a bigger part of his process. So I'm going to save this here, talk about this more. What I would probably recommend is the very first thing I would look at is I would look if the game state itself has changed. So for example, let's say you make an adjustment that you think we are under on Steph Curry tonight and a better projection for him is 56 points, right? That's pretty high, but maybe let's just say what you think it is. And then as the slate goes on later, we get news that someone like Wiggins is ruled out. Right? So Wiggins is playing, right? Yeah, he's playing. So we get rules that Wiggins is ruled out, right? And that resims the game and it bumps up his projection, right? Now to his SaberSim projection now to 55 points, right? In that situation, the game state itself has changed and Curry's projection going from 51 to 55 isn't necessarily so much a correction to something that was just wrong to begin with. It is the game state has changed and now we're bumping up his projection. In that particular case, I think it probably makes sense to bump his projection up even more, right? Now, let's say instead, right, that you've bumped Luka. Okay, so Porzingis is questionable, right? Let's say you've bumped Luka up to 53, right? You think that's a better projection for him, which maybe actually it is. Maybe bumping up Luka is actually a pretty sharp move, right? And then later throughout the slate, nothing changes, right? Porzingis right now, I believe, is projected. Oh, he's not. Yeah. Oh, he's projected just for a little bit. Okay, whatever. Let's say nothing changes about this game, right? One way or the other. But we just re-sim the game and Luka's projection has jumped up a little bit now, right? In that particular case, that feels to me more like a correction to the right projection value, to a better projection. And maybe in that particular case, you don't need to adjust anything. Or you could just reset it at this point to whatever the SaberSim projection is. The problem here, though, again, is that this is all happening pretty fast. And sometimes this is happening like on an 11-game slate tonight. There's going to be a lot of different teams in the mix. We're going to be getting a lot of different starting lineups. News is going to change very quickly. So I would say if you're in a crunch, right, if you're pressed for time, and if significant news has broken after lock and changed the slate, I would say what I would recommend, the best thing you can probably do is just reset and trust that making the late swap at all, updating to the most recent information, and then updating your lineups by late swapping is going to give you a significantly greater edge than whatever edge you were adding to your process by making your adjustments to the projections. That's what I would recommend. If you can kind of identify quickly if a game state has changed and it makes sense to adjust projections or vice versa, whatever, that's great. But again, the bigger the slate, the more news, the harder it's going to be to do that. And I would never sacrifice the edge you could potentially get by late swapping period and having the most information up to date for the sake of an adjustment you made at lock. So anyway, again, I know Max does a lot more of this than I do, so want to hear his thoughts, but yeah, okay, cool. So Bionic Knee is here. Yeah, so happy to answer that question again. Excited to hear what Max has to say. So I think just looking ahead, strategy sessions for NBA coming next week. We want to do kind of a video talking about how to conduct your own research for NBA. We did a similar one for NFL. I think it was called the 3 Steps to Better NFL Research. But NBA is a little bit different, especially knowing that this news can break and change the slate so significantly. So we want to kind of talk about how to conduct NBA research next week. We'll talk about this a little bit in that strategy session, but the one that I think will be very useful to see is Max's video on how he does his NBA process. Similar to the video I just put out for NFL, right? Max's NBA DFS process for a random slate that we pick out here in the next coming weeks. I think that will be a really good one to talk about this a little bit more. But anyway, for now, I'm going to move on here. There was a comment from Lundar here in Slack, and I already responded to this, but basically a request to be able to swap in players in the post-build process. So, you can build your lineups here, get your lineups up. We've had this request a lot. People that, look at their lineups at the end and maybe they're adjusting exposures, adjusting projections, doing whatever you do in step 3, but having an added feature of being able to just custom swap in or out certain players in your lineups here. That's on our roadmap. So that came up in our NBA, how the best NBA projections are made strategy session a couple weeks ago when we had Matt and Will on, and Matt confirmed that is definitely on the roadmap for us here. We have a few other features that we're hoping to put out before that. So again, just talking about maybe you're looking at this and you just want to direct one-to-one sub out Valanciunas for somebody else for whatever reason, right? Doing that here in step 3. So that's something we plan on delivering here, hoping to bring to you guys. There are, again, I mentioned there are some other features that we have planned for before that. But it's on the roadmap. I will say, since this comes up in office hours all the time, we do now have the ability to sort by ownership and salary in step 3. So for those of you that aren't in Slack in particular, we made an announcement in Slack yesterday. Just another reason to be in Slack, get access to some of this stuff a little bit earlier, hear about it a little bit faster. But you can now rank these by ownership or by salary. So if you are interested in just seeing out of curiosity, especially, what are the highest owned lineups in my pool of 500, right? I'm still playing with figuring out exactly how I want to incorporate this in my process, but I think that's been the most useful way so far, is to you can categorize or I don't know what the right word is, compartmentalize your lineups a certain way by knowing what the max and lowest ownership of your lineups are, right? So my highest owned lineup in my pool is 154% owned. My lowest, if you click this, it'll flip it, is 47% owned. Right, so very, very low owned. So then when I go back to SaberScore, I can kind of look at these and kind of get an idea of where the ownership of the top lineups that I'm getting for my SaberScore falls. And you can kind of see it's kind of right in the middle, but probably a little bit on the lower side. But here's a lineup with a little bit higher total ownership. So ownership at this point in the day probably still will improve quite a bit as we get closer to the slate, but definitely pretty cool. And for Showdown or NFL or maybe things that you're a little bit more plugged into the ownership anyway, I think pretty fun. So pretty cool stuff. Anyway, let's keep it rolling here. I'm going to hit some of these questions that came in through YouTube chat live here. So this one's from GB. Can you talk about how SaberScore is calculated? You mentioned lineup frequency in the past. Not sure what you mean. Yeah. Okay. So SaberScore in general, the general use of SaberScore. Oh wait, I just realized this is the reverse. Okay. So now actually you can see that these lineups here, sorted by SaberScore, the highest SaberScore lineups first are actually a little bit on the higher end of the total ownership, but some of these lower lineups. But anyway, what SaberScore is it is taking a look at the lineup as a whole and kind of taking into account the entire lineup correlation factors, how highly owned the lineup is as a whole, and what the overall total upside of that lineup is. It's basically an attempt to kind of quantify, pull together all three of the sliders that end up kind of controlling the upside of a lineup to begin with, and it's kind of judging a lineup on the whole of based on how well it meets these individual slider parameters, right? So I mentioned yesterday that the way a lineup is actually built with SaberSim is it's kind of built one player at a time. So like a player gets slotted in, then another player gets slotted in, then another player gets slotted in. The SaberScore is kind of a quality control measure where we can take this entire pool of 500 lineups that was built all in that way and then judge the best 20 based on our correlation, ownership, and the raw upside that the lineup has in the set of sims that were used to make that lineup. That's basically how it's calculated. I don't know the exact algorithm there. From what I understand from Matt, it's kind of complicated. There's a lot going on, a lot of variables involved there, but that's essentially what it does. And it is set, basically, it is measured at the sliders that were used for the contest. So for example, I mean, if you had the identical same set of lineups, of 500 lineups, but you calculated SaberScore at different default slider levels, you would get a different lineup showing up as the best lineup in that pool for each different set of sliders, which makes sense, right? Even if we just had a static set of 500 lineups, if we had this set of lineups, the lineup that is best here, this top lineup that is best for a 20 max between 10 and 50K people is not necessarily the lineup that is best for a 500 person single entry. So that's the way it works. But what you're referring to here with lineup frequency, I know exactly what you're talking about. That is a Showdown specific SaberScore nuance. So with Showdown, let's go to the Thursday night football game, right? So actually it's really just for Showdown. It really, in theory, it works anytime same variance is at 10, but it practically works mostly for Showdown, right? And what happens here is that when we're using single game simulations to determine the projections for each player when we build each lineup, right? For a Showdown, you're essentially getting to see every single lineup that we get out of here is a lineup that is optimal for a certain simulation, right? Because we're using single game simulations to determine the projections when we build each lineup. So every single lineup you see over here is literally the optimal lineup for a certain set of for a certain game simulation, right? But in reality, one single lineup, one combination of players can theoretically be the optimal lineup for multiple sets of game sims, right? Multiple different game simulations. So on Showdown, a lineup will get a bit of a SaberScore boost if it is the optimal lineup for multiple game sims. So this lineup here at the top, the 100 SaberScore lineup, maybe this is actually an optimal lineup of our 5,000 simulations of this game, or 10,000 or whatever it is. Maybe this lineup is actually the optimal lineup for, I don't even know what the right number is, maybe for 12 game simulations, right? So there's 12 ways of our 5,000 different game simulations of the way this game could actually play out where this lineup is actually optimal, just as an example. So we'll boost SaberScore in that particular spot. But it really only matters for sim variance 10 games with a single game on the slate, because otherwise the likelihood of a single lineup being optimal for a multiple set of game simulations is unlikely. So that's kind of what I was referring to there. But GB, let me know if that helps. Kind of both as the definition of the definition of SaberScore and also what I was referring to with lineup frequency here. Mostly a showdown thing there. So. Mr. Nice Guy asked, how can I make my lineups more contrarian? I play 150 lineups and find night after night they match the majority of the field. I assume you're talking about NBA. I will say right from the start here that NBA, because players are generally more normally distributed, their most common outcomes are centered around their average projected outcome. The chalkiest players on the slate are often good plays. And it is not always, a lot of times the right play is to be over the field on the chalkiest player on the slate. Like it was the right play to be over the field on Drummond 2 nights ago, and it was probably the right play to be over the field on Cade Cunningham last night, even though he failed, right? Because there are significant pricing inefficiencies in NBA where a significant portion of the player's range of outcomes are them meeting value. It just often makes sense to be a little bit more willing to play chalkier lineups in NBA. And you can see that directly here represented in our sliders, right? Even at a 150 max, over 50,000 entries for tonight, the ownership fade is only low, right? We're only considering ownership a little. For NFL, for this equivalent contest, the ownership fade slider would probably be at 4. And I think for MLB, it's at like 6 because of the spectrum of how reliably players hit their projections in these sports. Now, with all that said, there's nothing wrong with playing more contrarian if that's your approach. I think there's a few really good ways to do that. I would say the very first way to do that, is a combination of adjusting ownership projections, making sharp adjustments to ownership projections, and increasing your ownership fade slider. So, at a baseline, if you want to get away from what the field is going to do, I would tick this ownership fade slider up. I think starting with bumping it up by 1 or 2 notches is a good way to approach this. But the best way to figure out how high you should put this is to run test builds. See what actually happens if you put the ownership fade slider at 8 and see what your lineups look like then. And then you can kind of test this throughout the day and see where this ends up feeling right to you from where your lineups are. But I would start with smaller chunks. I would combine that with checking to see what the highest owned players are on a slate, right? We made some improvements to the ownership model before the start of this season. So I think this is the best our ownership projections have been ever for NBA. But there's always ways to add value, especially if you're really clued into ownership and kind of following the field on slates in particular where ownership is very flat. So like tonight, right? This is a pretty flat ownership curve. These are the nights in particular where I would really recommend spending a little bit of time diving into this a little further and seeing if you can see something that our model isn't in terms of who's going to be chalky. The slates like last night and the night before where there are very clear, excellent value plays on the slate are slates where it's very easy to project ownership. On the slates like tonight, where it's either a bigger slate or there aren't significant value opportunities, sometimes it's harder for any model to project ownership. And I think you can add value by making adjustments here if you're kind of clued into who's going to be chalky. So you don't have to touch every single player on the slate. I think that's a common misconception when I say, look at the ownership projections and make adjustments. You don't need to touch every single player. Just look for the guys that you think are going to be kind of the big, clear pivot plays and make sure that they are projected the way that you think is appropriate. I haven't studied this slate at all for tonight. So I don't know who's going to be chalky right now. I don't know what the Sixers salaries look like, but I assume those guys are still going to be pretty popular unless they got a big bump in salary. They didn't really. So I think these guys will probably still be pretty popular. There's a ton of guys out with COVID, right? So just kind of following the COVID path of fire that's running through the NBA right now and figuring out which teams are missing guys, I think is going to be an easy way to figure out who's pretty chalky. But those two things combined by default is going to be a very easy way of doing that. So the last thing I'll note there is in combination with that, let's say you bump up ownership fade to 6, right? And let's just build 20 lineups. I would say from there, you can be intentional with your leverage and your exposures in step 3 here to intentionally get under the field on the chalkier plays on the slate, right? The nice thing about this is that we're not going to, if you're playing just 20 lineups, we're not going to just build you 20. We're going to build you 500. The pool of 500 lineups that we build are what we feel are viable for the contest. And you can kind of check how heavily you can afford to fade a player based on if there are lineups in your pool that allow you to get there. Let me show you what I mean. This is stuck. I really want 500. I'm going to just delete this here and rebuild. Sometimes that'll happen. I know that can be a little bit frustrating. We do get questions about that close to lock. If you ever get a build that just kind of feels like it just got stuck at a certain number or is going much slower than you typically see, just stop it and start it over. Typically, the next build you build will just finish way easier than that one. See, like this, we're like, no problem here. So anyway, the other thing you can do here, so we've already increased the ownership fade slider, but we can kind of now be intentional. So you can actually see this. We're already now starting to fade some of these top players on the slate. I just sorted by ownership, and you can see we're already starting to fade some of these guys. We're not going to fade all of them, right? We're over the field on Eubanks because his value is really high. But you can kind of be even more aggressive here in step 3 by taking stands on some of these chalk plays. So if you think Svi, I think that's how you pronounce it, right? I think it's Svi Mikhailiuk. If you want to just totally fade him, right? Chalkiest player on the slate, at least how we project him right now, you can kind of check that and say, I want to fade him, right? And then maybe you take the same approach with here's another one. I think it's Seti, right? But maybe it's like Seti? I don't know. Let me know if you know how to pronounce his name. But maybe you can fade him too, right? And you can kind of check and see, like, how viable is this? At some point, if you just blindly fade all the chalk, you're going to see a message that says you need to build more lineups to do this. And at that point, SaberSim is saying to you, hey, you're outside the bounds of the first 500 lineups that we think are viable for this contest, and we need to build you more lineups. And at that point, it's a good opportunity to say, okay, maybe this is a little too aggressive, but you can see that line is pretty far, right? Particularly because we already built these lineups with a higher ownership fade slider. So these lineups are already less chalky than they would have been. But you can kind of test this and see clearly it lets you go pretty far. So those are the things that I would do. I would say add value by making adjustments to ownership projections, particularly on slates where we have ownership projected pretty flatly. If you can identify the chalk easier, and then turn your ownership fade slider up, we turned it up 4 notches in this case to 6. That might be a little high, but start with maybe just 1 to 2. I think 1 to 2 is probably a little bit more appropriate. I would say if default is 2, I would say turn it up to 3 or 4, and then make adjustments to your exposures in step 3 to come in under the field on chalk plays. You don't need to necessarily fade every play, but come in under the field on chalk plays. Make sure that your leverage is negative for those players, or fade them completely if you want. And I think that will very, very quickly get you to playing much more contrarian lineups. So the last thing I'll note there, just again as a reminder, is that I would be a little cautious with this in NBA because chalk is better in NBA. The best projected value plays often are their range of outcomes, since it is normally distributed, the majority of their outcomes are them meeting the value they need to be GPP profitable, right? You think, I don't like the idea of target scores too much in general, but if you think somebody like, I don't know, like Eubanks, right? Let's say he's going to be pretty chalky. I think he probably is if he's actually 8x value, right? To pay off his salary and be efficient at the min price, what does he need? Like 18 points, realistically? That's here. So you can look at what portion of his outcomes is over that. That's why these players reliably hit these scores, and chalk is pretty good in NBA. You compare that to something like baseball in particular, right? The vast majority of any baseball hitters outcomes are under what they need to score to be efficient at their salary, even if they are the best projected plays on the slate. That's why we like to fade chalk in baseball. So anyway, getting a little wordy here, have a tendency to do that. Get excited talking about one particular question. I sit here and I go. So let's move on. Let me know if you have any other questions about that. Tryhard Sweat had a couple questions here, and I know there are questions in Slack too. We'll get back to those. I saw this was actually one of the questions that came in. I saw you had a YouTube comment for me, so I planned on talking about this today. But do SaberSim projections update when players get ruled out throughout the day? Is that accounted for when games get simmed? Yes, indeed it is. We have improved the speed with which we update our information for news and how quickly those sims actually run significantly this offseason. So at times we actually even now beat the news coming out by a couple seconds, but we basically sim at least in the hour before lock and after lock, we'll be re-simming games basically as quickly as news breaks. So you can always see the last time we updated our projections up here. Last updated, I'm in Mountain Time here, so 12:17 p.m. That will be the last time we updated. But if you want to get very plugged into what news is breaking and what sims we are running, I recommend joining our Slack community and going into the NBA lineup alerts channel. So NBA lineup alerts channel will tell you, what sims are running, when the sims start, when they complete. It's also plugged into the Fantasy Labs Twitter and will show you when news is breaking. So you can join our Slack community. There is a link to join in the description of every past office hours video. There will be one in the description of this video if you watch this as a recording. But if you're watching live, that link is in any of the past videos. So piggyback on that question, what is the latest time it will update? If a player gets ruled out 20 minutes before lock, will that update? I mean, if a player gets ruled out 1 minute before lock, it will update. Our sims are typically running in 2 minutes or less at this point. So there is a line where we just can't possibly get updated that fast enough. Also, coupled with the fact that NBA starting lineups, well, NBA games often start 10 to 15 minutes late anyway, and NBA lineups often come out at the last second. Sometimes you can get screwed where, I don't know. There were situations last season where we got NBA lineups that came out after the official start time of the game, right? That happens sometimes. But we will update basically down to the final minute before a game starts with the information that we have about the game, starting lineups, injury news, minutes restrictions, anything like that. So anyway, Tryhard Sweat says, I play the $12 single entry 90% of the time. I normally hand build and do pretty well. The last few times I use SaberSim to save some time and have not cashed. Is this any good for single entry contests? I don't MME. Well, a few things. So, I mean, one, yes. I mean, our tools are still very well equipped for single entry contests, but we're not going to build you lineups meant to min cash, right? If you're doing a lot of your own hand building and you're finding that you are cashing often, you are probably playing lineups that have a very high min cash equity in that contest, that have a very high probability of min cashing, playing a lot of just the best projected plays overall. But if that lineup isn't really taking any risk on at all, its first place or top 1% equity is probably a lot lower. Whereas with SaberSim, we are not going to build lineups built to min cash, right? Even in a single entry, like that contest, I think is single entry and about 1,000 people here, right? Like we're not going to incorporate ownership at all, but we are going to incorporate a decent amount of variance into that lineup. And we're going to build a lineup that's actually pretty correlated for a single entry kind of contest. And that kind of lineup is not necessarily going to have high min cash equity. It's not going to have a lot of probability of min cashing, but it is going to have higher than its fair share of top 1% equity in theory, and will be profitable over the long term. So yes, I think we can still be profitable for single entry players. The only other thing I would mention there is that our contest selection and bankroll management strategy is overall to very much encourage you to consider multi-entry, right? The more playing even if you're just going to play $12 of volume every night, I would say that going towards maxing out the quarter jukebox, playing the $1 single entry, the $2 single entry, and then maybe playing 5 bullets into the $1 20 max, right, is probably a better investment. You get 25 to 30 lineups in play and give yourself a lot better chance of having a high upside lineup on any given slate, right? You're essentially getting 25 to 30 times more shots on goal in a single slate than you do with just a single entry lineup. Even if you are playing with a positive expected value, you are playing in a way that is profitable. Playing 1 bullet every single slate, right, gives you 82 shots the entire season. It could take you years. It could take you literally seasons to realize that expected value, even if you're playing profitably. That's why we recommend multi-entry. Not to say you have to multi-entry. I know some people don't like it. Single entry people, that's totally fine. I get it. But that is our recommendation. That's why that's our recommendation. And I think SaberSim in particular is so well equipped. There's really no difference from the app's standpoint and from like your individual process standpoint from building one lineup in 20. There's almost no difference. You use a different set of settings and you've got a couple more lineups in your pocket here at the end, right? But your approach, the way you would do that process on SaberSim is identical all the way from adjusting projections to entering the lineup itself. So I cannot encourage somebody enough to at least try to play some multi-entry if you're only playing single entry at the moment. One, to spread out risk, but two, because it just makes it, SaberSim makes it so easy. And the last note on that before I move on, I'll say is that the field doesn't multi-entry very well, right? I think most DFS players that are at least familiar with DFS, familiar with the concepts, not brand new, are going to be able to probably build like one decent lineup, whether they're using a traditional optimizer or whether they're hand building, right? A lot of people that have been playing at least for a little while and are familiar or maybe watched a couple of videos can put together a pretty decent lineup. Those same players are going to struggle significantly if they're asked to put 20 lineups together. They're either going to be way overexposed to certain players. They're going to be having these extremely high risk portfolios. They might start building lineups that have way lower projection, that have no chance of cashing. They may be playing lineups that are way too chalky. There's a ton of different things that can go wrong once you ask somebody that's using hand building or a traditional optimizer to build their second, third, fourth, fifth, 15th, 16th, 17th, 140th, 141st lineup, right? Those kinds of things are hard. I think that's another edge that isn't really often talked about in DFS, is that there are single entry contests are great. They have great payout structures. They have high effective entrance. They're good contests. But the ability of the field to multi-enter effectively and profitably is not very high. So anyway, all that to say, yes, SaberSim can still excel at single entry. You may find our lineups min cash less. The reason why is because they have a higher win equity. And I urge you to try some multi-entry, especially if you're trying SaberSim. So, all right, cool. I'm going to jump back over to Slack. I know there was there was a question here from Elusive Smoke. Let's take a look. Get into this. And Lundar, I see your question in YouTube chat. We'll get to that next. Smoke said, I was wondering if there's a way to redo all builds with new projections. If you have 4 to 5 different build types for different size and types of contests, small field, SAT, cash, small single entry GPP, mid-size GPP, large GPP build, you get late news with 5 minutes to go and you are playing on a couple sites, it would be nice if there was a way to do the rebuilds on all open builds. This is really important to respond to late news that causes a guy who would not be in your initial builds at all. The way you can tag the build to entries in the entry editor, you can re-upload quickly. Is that possible? This similar question came in yesterday, and I didn't get a response to it. So let me go. The question that came in yesterday was basically if I have like multiple builds. So say these are just your 2 builds that you have, and it's lock and news breaks, and you don't want to rebuild completely, but you have like 2 minutes and you just need these lineups to have the most recent projections. The question was, do you need to enter both builds to update projections? And I don't know the answer to that question. I still don't know. So I will follow back up on that today and see if I can get an answer here on that, because I'm really not sure. In terms of actually rebuilding everything, like this is just referring to refreshing the projections of a build that already exists. The idea of like triggering a mass rebuild is not something that there is a way to do right now. I can see why that would be valuable for sure. That is just it's an intensive thing to do, especially imagining that happening for potentially like all users here. My recommendation is that if news breaks that is significant with minutes to go, that like is going to have an impact on the projections, I think you are probably going, your best way to add the most amount of value in that amount of time is to split everything by cash and not cash. Rebuild your cash lineup, put it into all your cash lineups, and rebuild all of the other lineups together with one unique build with some kind of medium set of sliders and roll with it and go with it there. The difference, the value you are going to add by having lineups that have the most up-to-date projections is far greater than the value you are going to add by having the perfectly optimized sliders for each individual contest, especially in a sport like NBA where the sliders don't change as dramatically from contest to contest, right? There are differences here, but there's not the same level of difference that you would see in something like baseball or NFL that I think if something breaks that legitimately changes the slate with 5 to 15 minutes to go, I think you are better off rebuild cash separately and then just group all of your other things together with kind of a medium set of projections and one build and fill uniquely. That's the best way to do it at the moment. So, I don't know if that is the most satisfying answer for you, Elusive Smoke. I'm sure, I know you're a regular here. I'm sure you kind of already maybe know to do that. But Smoke said, that's what I do, but it seems like a huge waste to do all these builds and then scrap them and redo with a less optimal build. Yeah, I completely agree. And honestly, at this particular point in my NBA process, I have just simply stopped doing all those different builds. And I just create one build to fill all these different contests. And I will pick a set of sliders that's kind of middle ground between all of them, and that will be my build for this reason exactly, because I got frustrated with having a single entry build, a 3 max build, a 20 max build, a satellites build, all these different builds of lineups that you know, I lost my train of thought. I got frustrated with having to redo all of those with just 5 or 15 minutes left to go. And I think it's easier to react. I would rather have one single build with a unique lineup for every entry I'm going to be playing, at least for my GPPs, that allows me to have a little bit of time to add some value, maybe in the form of editing exposures or projections or things like that, than trying to just mass update 6 different builds at the last second. So that's where I've gotten to it. That's where I've gotten to with this. But yeah. So the other way I like to think about it too is, you know, the competition is even less equipped to deal with this problem, right? Like it's easy to forget all of the things that is actually fortunately being included here with the SaberSim approach. Somebody using a traditional optimizer is like scrambling to rebuild their player groups at the last second, right? To adjust to this news, much less rebuild all the lineups and figure out what the new way to deal with ownership and how players are now correlated with one another because Giannis is sitting 5 minutes before lock, right? So I think that there's a big edge to updating as quickly as possible and giving yourself a bit of time to maybe add a little bit of additional value. That doesn't make sense for me in my process to scramble to build 6 different builds to optimize for the exact sliders. But Bionic Knee said, do you use the late swap on entry editor? Wouldn't that let you pick what would be rebuilt? Yeah, I mean, it does, but it doesn't. Like, you could go in. Do I have entries here? So you could go in here and say, okay, it's last second. I've only got a bit of time, and I'm just going to quickly do all of my single entry builds, right, and rebuild those first. But you are still stuck with the problem, the original problem I think that Smoke is referring to here of you still have to do those things separately, right? You would still have to go through and select just the single entries and rebuild, and then just the 20 max and rebuild, and so on. So, yeah, it's definitely, I think it's a frustrating thing. Smoke said it would be a super easy way to add V, like that could easily be worth 5 to 10% ROI. I think you're probably adding 5 to 10% ROI by reacting to late news efficiently and rebuilding, period, personally. I don't know. I think from what it sounds like you're saying is basically like 5 you would add 5 to 10%, 5 to 10 percentage points of ROI by late swapping your lineups precisely, or not late swapping, but rebuilding your lineups at the last second precisely to what their individual slider settings are set at. And I don't know if that's true. Like, put another way, the difference between your sliders that are set at a single entry that is 5,000 people, if you used these slider settings to build lineups for a 20 max that is 10 to 50,000 people, I am not sure that difference in slider settings amounts to 5 to 10% of ROI over the long term. I am not sure if it is that level of difference on your sliders. Could be. I'd be curious how impactful. I think that'd be an interesting analysis of like how impactful in terms of expected value is a -2 minus, I don't know, 2 notches off on your sliders, 2 notches suboptimal for your particular thing. I'd be curious what that actual value is, but I don't know. I'm not sure that it's Smoke said do satellites though. Those are significantly different. Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, those are depending on which ones you're playing, right? I'm not sure they're that different though. Like there aren't a ton of enormous satellites, right? I feel like the biggest satellite that you're going to see is probably like 10K entrance, maybe something like a 20 max. But a lot of them are probably smaller than that, or even like 3 max or single entry. Right? I could be wrong. Maybe I don't, as far as I know, there aren't any 150 max satellites, right? But I just mean if you maybe just kind of grouped and said like the sliders I'm going to use to build for tonight's slate are something like 3-2-6. That's kind of in between. That kind of fits everything I'm playing decent. You get pretty close. So anyway, I totally get what you're saying. I definitely recognize that there is something that is being given up here. And I think I'll bring this back to the rest of the team because I definitely see how this is valuable. And as an improvement, as we continue to try to get better, I can see like this is a hole here, a bit of trying to react late, especially in a sport where having to react late is important. So, but anyway, for now, I'm going to move on. A couple other questions that have come in here while we've been talking about this. Nutra Noche said, when you upload entries, can I upload cash and GPP entries separately to create builds? You don't have to separate them. So in the entry editor, you can upload your entire entries file, which is very easy to just get from DraftKings. Either when you first hit the entry editor, you'll see this message that says upload entries, and it has a link that says download template file. You can just download it. It'll just start downloading. If you've already uploaded an entry file, you can also go into upload new entries, click download template file from DraftKings, re-download that file and re-upload. From there, we will split these up for you. So I'm only playing GPPs tonight. Haven't been playing a lot of cash so far this season, but if you were playing cash, you can separate your GPP, cash multiplier, and satellite here. And I guess while we're on the subject, Smoke, if you're still watching, this maybe is one other thing to consider that would simplify things a bit, is if you were really pressed for time, last second chance to swap something, you could group here, do all of your GPPs together, late swap. You can use late swap before lock. Doesn't have the same effect as building 500, but it works. Then do cash and then do satellites. And we'll like pick all 3 of those up separately. That might be a good approach too, where you're not stuck having to rebuild as many builds, but you can kind of last second group cash, GPP, and satellite. But anyway, Nutra Noche, yeah, you can go ahead and go in here. And specifically, if you select cash, you can pick this. All of your cash contests will show up. You can fill these lineups with your cash you can fill these entries with your cash lineup. You can, when it comes time to late swap, you can specifically select by cash and swap your cash entries separately from your GPPs. We do all that for you. So don't have to upload them separately. Cool. Don's got a pretty big question here for me. What is your NBA DFS strategy? Do you modify projections or exposures or both? It is a good question. So I think personally, my overall approach to NBA in 2021, right, going into this season, is that there are the 2 biggest edges by far that you have over the field is contest selection and late swap. So I have personally optimized my strategy to capitalize on both of those things. I am playing a limited selection of contests that I think are very soft contests to play, and I am late swapping frantically every single time a sim runs, whether there is big news or small news. If a sim runs, if the projections have updated, I am rebuilding my lineups. And I think those are the two biggest edges that there are in NBA DFS in 2021. I think there is value in having a very good NBA model. We have put a lot of time into making sure our NBA projections and ownership this season are as accurate as possible. I think this is the best that those projections have ever been. But I do think projecting NBA is easier than it is in a lot of other sports. Correlation value in NBA, while correlations are still important on the right slate, like a night like tonight, we do have a decent sized correlation value depending on your contest. The individual values of correlations between players are much lower. So you get a lot less out of like stacking to create positive correlations or intentionally avoiding negative correlations. Those values are a lot smaller. So there's less of a correlation edge. Ownership numbers, right? Because players are generally pretty normally distributed, their most common outcomes are centered around their mean. If you have a decent set of average projections, which are pretty easy to come by, right? The field is going to find the best plays pretty easy. I think there is an ownership edge in NBA, but I think there's less of one compared to something like baseball. I think, in fact, a lot of times the ownership edge in NBA DFS is the opposite than it is in baseball. Whereas in baseball, if there's a Coors Field game and I look down after the cards get flipped over and all the hitters in that game are 40% owned, I am often celebrating the fact that I faded that game. In NBA, I have the opposite approach where, like 2 nights ago, the cards get flipped over and I see Andre Drummond is only 60% owned at low stakes, and I'm celebrating that he's not 90% owned, right? Like, I think the ownership edge is often in NBA people not playing the best plays enough rather than the other way around. All of this to say, I think it is easier to build a good NBA DFS lineup with just a traditional optimizer that is building lineups optimized for average projection, because correlative factors are lower and chalk is kind of good. So the two biggest edges I think there are late swap and contest selection. So that ultimately ends up influencing my process. While there are a lot of different things that you can do in a build here, and you guys have probably seen me do in my baseball and my football videos, right? My research builds, for example, to determine which players are suboptimally owned, which players are the good players to get leverage on, so on, those kinds of things. I don't do a lot of that for basketball because I know I'm going to be late swapping 30 minutes to an hour after lock almost every single slate, right? I think there's a little bit less value going in. While I could go through and run the research builds for lock, perfectly dial in all of my exposures to get the leverage exactly on the right guys I want, I would have to do the whole thing again at 5:30. Right? Again, I'm Mountain Time, so 7:30 Eastern. I'd probably have to do it again at 8. I'd probably have to do it again at 9, right? And I think the edge of the fact that the field just isn't late swapping often enough is just way higher than any value I'm going to add by trying to perfectly optimize the leverage I'm getting on certain players. So that's been my approach, is like basically I am taking a pretty light touch to projections. One thing I will do if I feel like our ownership numbers are a little bit off on a guy that I think is going to be a lot more chalky, I will update his ownership projection. I will manage my risk on certain players. I think that's a good place to add some value here. Let's go back to our original test build, right? I will consider managing some risk on some of these plays. I am way more willing to get way over the field on what I perceive to be the best value plays on the slate in a sport like basketball compared to other sports, but I will adjust my max exposure down on certain players, particularly if they just don't match up. Like a guy like an 8x value play like Drew Eubanks, I'm probably just going to have a ton of exposure to, but maybe I don't need 50 points of leverage on fairly modestly projected Julius Randle, right? Maybe I will do some of this sometimes, but I think the biggest edge that I can get is by late swapping. So I'm not making a bunch of adjustments before lock, to be completely honest. So that's just my approach. If you're interested in kind of more of a deep dive into either late swap or contest selection for NBA, I'd go check out these strategy sessions. So late swap, biggest edge in NBA DFS in 2021. It's like an hour long of me talking about similar to what I just talked about before. And then this video I just put out today, 40 minutes of me talking about contest selection in NBA, what the fundamentals of contest selection principles that I use to pick my contests, and also the exact contests that I would play on DraftKings and FanDuel as your bankroll grows. Those are the edges I think that you really have. This would also be another video that I think you would find interesting is the 4 keys to beating NBA DFS in 2021, because there are other edges here, right? There are other things that we can do. So this is a video where Max and I kind of break down what we think are like literally the 4 primary edges that we have in NBA DFS in 2021. That includes late swap, but includes some other things in there too. That would be another video that I think is a little bit more interesting for you to watch too. But AJ says, does SaberSim account for the ownerships of players already locked in play when it reoptimizes? At the moment, it does not. But that is something we're kind of working on behind the scenes here. So this idea of when you late swap, pull in somehow the actual known ownerships of the players that have already started their games, and then based on how owned those players are and how well those players are performing, re-optimize, re-late swap optimally, right? Like a lineup that is doing bad and is chalky needs to get way less chalky on the players that are still left to play. A lineup that is doing really good and has already had some really good low-owned plays go off, right? That lineup you can afford to get a little more chalky and try to block, right? I think that's kind of this is definitely a very trendy strategy in the DFS content space. Hear that a lot, especially for NFL. With one big late swap opportunity between the morning and afternoon games, I think a lot of sharp players are really starting to do this a lot. That's something we plan on implementing. So, cool. Let's see. A few other questions have come in here. GB said, if I'm playing the best 60 SaberScore lineups and want to remove some of the top ownership lineups, how would I do this? Okay, so what I would do, how I would approach this is, let's say you have this build, right? Let's say you're building 60 lineups out of this. First of all, I would, now that we have this nice fancy new ownership sort, I would look at your highest ownership lineup. So the highest ownership lineup in this particular pool is 149 total lineup ownership, right? So basically SaberSim is saying to you kind of the maximum amount of ownership you can play in this contest, at least in this particular set of lineups, is 149. So then if you go back to SaberScore, I would say you can kind of categorize, you can kind of like think about your lineups now from that lens. So you can see, you can literally see the ownership fade in action here, where SaberSim is saying the best lineups to play, though, are actually the ones that are a little bit lower owned. But here's that 149 projected ownership lineup, right? And maybe it's a good opportunity to remove that lineup. If you wanted to remove it, you can just uncheck it. And now it's going to say, do you want to fill back up to 60 lineups? You could hit that now. You could also wait and do this all at once and just kind of scan through here and just look for lineups that are close to like 149. The rest of these look pretty good. 144, you know, maybe you're better off playing a different lineup that's not 144, provided that the Saber scores are about equal, which it like looks like they are. 135, maybe that's good enough for you. Maybe it isn't. I don't know. That's the way I would use this. 146, right? Maybe you're just getting like rid of lineups projected over 140. Now, the one thing I will add on again here, right, is that like if this was my process, I would say, you know, you are going to have to late swap these. You are likely going to have to late swap these lineups. So there's a decision you have to make of, you know, is this worth it, right? Because you're going to have to late swap, and you have less control over this thing when you ultimately end up late swapping. GB said, "Can I do this without scanning and sort those 60?" Like, no, you can't at the moment. I can see what you're talking about, right? Like maybe something that just says like a filter, remove all lineups over 140 ownership sum. I think that is kind of the phase 2 of this ownership sort. It's a little bit more involved on our end. This was a very easy thing to implement quickly, so we got that up. But I don't think there is a way to do this without scanning at the moment. I don't think so, unfortunately. So, Lundar, looks like I missed your question. Let's go back. So another question about ownership sort. Do you think that sorting lineups by ownership and also looking for upside by saying using the 75th percentile dropdown seems like a good strategy? High upside, low ownership combo. Interesting. I don't think it'll change anything, right? In my mind, if you sorted by low owned, for example, let's say you're looking at purely the lowest owned lineups you can find, I would imagine that this wouldn't change anything because the lowest owned lineup is still the lowest owned lineup, even if you update the percentage, even if you update the percentile. Yeah. So it's not going to change anything because this is going to sort by the lowest ownership lineup, period. Right? So changing your percentile isn't really going to have that. It isn't going to change anything here. I would say one thing is like to keep in mind is that when you sort by SaberScore, we are already really accounting for upside in that particular case, right? Sorting your lineups by SaberScore is really our attempt to quantify the highest upside lineups already. Oops. So you don't need to change the percentile to maximize your upside. The percentile is just a way of visualizing kind of what a lineup might look like if all the players were to hit an 85th percentile outcome score. But SaberScore kind of already quantifies the upside of the lineup overall. So I would say if you want to kind of in step 3 do a little bit of quality control for finding some lower owned lineups, I would do a bit of what I was just demonstrating before, where you could kind of manually go through and remove some higher percentage owned lineups from your lineup set. I think that might be a better approach overall. To be completely honest, though, this ownership sort is brand new. Came out yesterday. I've really only been experimenting with it for about as long as you guys have. So I would be interested to hear creative uses that you guys have coming up with for this, ways that you're finding that you can add value in your process. And we can kind of figure it out together. We did the same thing with the leverage column, right? So this leverage column was new with the redesign that we put out. When the redesign first dropped, there were a lot of these office hours streams where people were asking for the best use of this new leverage column. And I think I have now arrived at what I think is most useful for it. I think it's very useful in research builds to quickly determine what the best fades are and what the best stands are. And I think it's really useful in step 3 to manage your risk and quickly just see which players you're most overexposed to. But when it first came out, right, it was something that, I don't always know necessarily right off the top of my head what the best way to do it is. So I would say same deal here. I have mostly that my personal use that I found over not even 24-hour period for the ownership sort is looking and getting an idea of what the spectrum of ownership is for my entire lineup pool. I think that's really useful. I think it's way more useful to be able to say, okay, my top lineups are about 135, 125% total ownership sum, dropping from there. And the highest overall ownership lineup in the pool is 149. And the lowest is whatever it was, like 50, right? I think that's useful, at least to just know. I'm interested to see, I'm excited to actually play with this a little bit on Showdown too. I'm actually very interested to see on Showdown, like what is my top ownership sum lineup? And then what are my top SaberScore lineups and how much ownership can I eat for Thursday Night Football? So I'm going to mess with it a little bit then, but GB said, I found that by going to pool and sorting by ownership, I can quickly remove high-owned lineups by repeating quickly. Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great approach. So, and again, I mean, the one other thing to note here too is that, like, for example, let's put these lineups back in. These are the lineups we trashed before. Oh, okay, yeah. So, like, the one thing to remember here too is I don't want to say I'm not like a SaberScore apologist here. I don't think SaberScore is the end all be all necessarily. There's obviously ways to add value here in step 3, but it is important to remember that kind of SaberScore is taking into account ownership. So in some ways, like a lineup like this, the SaberScore is saying, in spite of the fact that this is the highest ownership sum lineup in the entire pool of 500, it is still the third best lineup you can play. So remember that too, is that, there's a reason we don't come to step 3 and sort the lineups by projected score and remove all lineups over a certain ownership sum, right? That sounds very much like something you might get at maybe a different lineup optimizer, right? There's a reason we don't do it that way. So exercise a little bit of caution here with that, but I'm excited about this. So, cool. Okay. Got some other questions here. Nancy Drew guy said, can you custom make a spreadsheet that would better guide us to selecting the right contest for the salary we have, kind of like in the video you put out today, but have that spreadsheet on the site, kind of like a spreadsheet calculator. Yeah. So the problem is like the contests don't change often, but they do change, right? They're not always the same. Doing something like that, like the right way, would ultimately either kind of require like me to go in and check every day and see what the contests look like and then re-update it, or like plug in directly with the DraftKings like API to do that almost. I think it's a cool idea. I would say like, I think my goal, what would be awesome is for you guys to kind of internalize a lot of what I'm talking about in that video yourself and learn to kind of identify how to pick these things out yourself, right? That's basically kind of like all I was doing is going through and based on the principles that we've laid out, pick the best contests. And maybe you're playing NFL and NBA and you want to start playing golf, right? And then be able to go into the golf lobby and say, okay, like what are the principles that we always talk about here? Effective entrance, under $3, as many lineups as possible, right? Now let me go ahead and try to pick like the best golf contests. What I can do is I can make that spreadsheet available to anybody that wants a copy of it. The one that kind of has like, at least in that video at the end of each site, I had the spreadsheet that kind of listed out every contest at that point in rough order of how I would play them. I can make a copy of that spreadsheet available to anybody that wants one. I would say, shoot me a message on Slack and I can just make you a copy of it and you can just have it. It could be yours. It's not exactly what you're referring to here with like a calculator of, fill in the bankroll and then it tells you what contest to play, but it's probably not very far off from that. Just keeping in mind that the contests are going to change, right? Like it even changes. It can change kind of quickly. Like DraftKings has already changed some stuff this season. At the start of the year, right? If I had made the same video 2 weeks ago, this $3 contest, let's see. So DraftKings has this 4-point play, right? The $4.20 max, and they have this $3 sharpshooter. 2 weeks ago, those were flipped. This contest was a much smaller contest, and this one was a big contest. So this would have been the better contest to play 2 weeks ago, and now it's this one. And they did the same thing with their 3-entry maxes. So this $3 3-entry max is now what I feel like is a pretty good contest to play. A few weeks ago, this contest was bad. It had like 1,000 entrants total, and there was a $4 3-entry max that was much better. So again, if DraftKings or FanDuel ever decide to change their contests up, the video unfortunately ends up not being as useful. The calculator ends up, the hypothetical calculator would end up not being as useful. So anyway, long story short is I think what is most useful is to kind of start getting an idea of why those contests are the best ones to play and then learning how to do that yourself. But with all that said, DM me on Slack if you want a copy of the spreadsheet that I made. I'll make you a copy. That's no problem. So, and Nancy Drew, guys, since you're here and I'm already answering your question, I wanted to respond. I know you had sent in a question yesterday that I missed. And the question was, should you change your sliders when you're late swapping? And I wanted to briefly just touch on that here and say that I would say the answer is in general, no. So you don't need to do that. The sliders that are optimal when you late swap, like the sliders that are set for your particular contest are still the optimal sliders for that contest when you late swap it. However, I would say if you have a good reason to believe that the field is not going to late swap optimally. So situations where the field is not going to late swap optimally, I think, are at lower stakes, right? The lower your stakes, especially if you're under $3, you're playing against softer opponents that aren't going to understand that they need to late swap, right? They're gonna late swap less. And also when I would say bigger news breaks, like significant news breaks post lock, there's bigger impact news breaking lock after lock. Like last night, Ayton gets ruled out after lock. Brandon Ingram gets ruled out after lock. All of these high impact players happen, right? The more high impact the late swap news is. I think you can justify turning down some of these sliders because you're getting enough of an edge from the late swap period that you don't need this additional edge of things like ownership fade or whatever, right? Fading ownership kind of really comes from the standpoint almost of like, you get more value out of fading ownership the more optimal the ownership is in the contest. Right? So, I don't know. You have the, let's use the example from last night, right? So, Ayton gets ruled out after lock. And let's say the optimal ownership for JaVale McGee after Ayton gets ruled out is 35%, just as an example, right? If the field is going to own JaVale McGee at 35%, that's kind of why we want to have ownership fade at a non-zero value, is because it forces the builder to kind of consider that situation and say, what's the game theory approach, right? Does it make sense to take the opposite approach, even on a good play, and fade this guy because the field is owning him efficiently? But when the field doesn't own a player efficiently in general, we get a lot less out of fading ownership, and we get a lot more out of just playing the best plays, right? If the field never found the best plays, if you were playing against a field of robots that randomized their lineups every single slate and didn't make any good plays except by sheer luck, you wouldn't even care about ownership at all. You would only care about playing the best plays. We want to value ownership more in situations where the field is playing optimally. So with all that said, I think you can justify turning ownership down or off, and even turning variance down or off if you are playing lower stakes where players are going to play less optimally, and when big news breaks after lock that like allows you to get much better plays. So I've been doing that for late swap, is on the slates where there is significant news breaking post lock that I don't think the field is going to react to. I've been turning down my ownership fade, and I've been turning down my sim variance a bit to rebuild my lineups to just get most of those best plays in them and go from there. The other consideration too, this is the last thing I'll say on this and then I'll move on, is when you are late swapping, you don't have, because some players are already locked in your lineup, you don't have as much lineup flexibility to get the best plays in. So like, let's say last night, again, I know Kaminsky played a bunch and McGee ended up having a good game, but maybe not as high of a game as he could have, but whatever. I'll just keep using that example. Maybe after Ayton got ruled out, the optimal ownership of JaVale McGee was 80%, right? The optimal exposure you would have in a set of 100 lineups was 80%. Well, because certain players are already locked into the lineups and salary requirements and positional requirements and things like that, maybe you could only get 60% JaVale McGee maximum, right? I don't want the builder to sacrifice opportunities to play the new great play in JaVale McGee because of his ownership or because the sim variance dice roll landed on the wrong side of McGee, right? Limiting my maximum exposure I can get to that player even further, right? Like my risk is already managed on JaVale McGee because I'm playing only 60% when optimal ownership was 80%. I don't want the builder then to only give me 50% of him because my ownership fade slider was up here and because my sim variance slider was up here. I generally just want to pack in the best place. So the further along the slate goes too, the more I'm likely to do that. But let me know if that makes sense. Curious if anybody has any questions as well. I think that can be pretty useful. So Crypto said, when you have 5+ single entries with the over 2K effective entrance, does it make sense to use rank instead of unique on the highest buy-in? Okay, so first of all, a very important note here is rank is going to take the top overall lineup in your pool, and it is going to put it in as the first lineup into every single contest you are filling. So I think there's a common misconception here, and honestly, it's good to know that this is confusing people because we can do a better job of making this more clear. But when we fill by rank, so for example, let's just take these random 63 lineups, we'll fill by rank. It is the same lineup that is going in first to every single contest here. It is the first lineup in here. It is the first lineup in here. It is the only lineup in all 4 of these contests. And then it was the first lineup in here. And then the second lineup goes in here, here, and here. The third lineup goes here, here, and so on. Crypto said, I just mean on the highest and the rest use unique. Okay, yeah, so I get kind of what you were saying is, does it make sense then to manually say, I want my highest SaberScore lineup in my highest dollar contest, my second highest SaberScore lineup in my second highest dollar contest? That's a common request. There isn't really an easy way to do that apart from what you're describing here, like manually clicking in and making sure the right lineups go into the right place. I think another alternative is doing that with the CSVs and directly kind of editing your CSV file to get that done. In terms of, is it worth it? Is that valuable? I actually don't think it is. The difference between your SaberScore of those top lineups is going to be close enough that I don't think there is a significant expected value edge in your 100 SaberScore lineup versus your 99.8 SaberScore lineup, such that I would actually care very much where these lineups ended up. Even in a pool like tonight, like I'm playing 47 lineups, I've just been using the unique fill, and I'm basically assuming that the expected value of the 47th ranked lineup, which is the 97.1 SaberScore lineup compared to the 100th SaberScore lineup, again, is close enough that it doesn't matter. But the first time that you bank and the lineup that banks is in your lowest dollar contest, you're going to feel salty about it. And I get that. And if you think you're going to feel really salty about that, then it may make sense to just go into the CSVs if you have the time to do it, or use the entry editor in a more manual way to force that top lineup into the top overall dollar contest. We're planning on making an update to the entry editor here in the near future that does that automatically for you. Right now, you can't do it automatically, but that's kind of what I would say. I don't think you're actually adding real expected value by doing that, but it's easy to feel kind of upset if the variance swings the wrong way. I mean, because in reality, it can swing the right way for you just as easily, right? That's the thing you got to remember is like, yeah, you could put your best overall lineup in your $1 when it could have been in the $50, and it's a huge difference, right? But also, even if you're going into the trouble of doing this with the CSVs, you could have your best lineup in the $1 anyway, right? Or vice versa. You could uniquely fill and just leave it up to randomness, and just by chance have your best lineup out of 50 end up in your highest dollar contest. And that lineup that maybe would have made you 2x makes you 500x in the right contest, right? Like some of that's just, there's always going to be a little bit of variance here, no matter how you're filling your contests. So. Also on this question, often I get the late swap error saying the builder couldn't make enough lineups. Is that because of what you just said, so that the lineups could swap did and those that didn't error out? Gotcha. Yeah. So there can be a variety of reasons why that might happen. What it means is that there's a rule set somewhere that the builder can no longer follow. I would say a few things to check. It's difficult to know exactly, like without seeing the exact situation that's happening here. I would check on your exposures that you have set in the entry editor here. It is possible, for example, maybe you have a minimum exposure set on a player that has been since ruled out. I would check if you don't have a lot of time. One very easy thing to do is to just sacrifice your exposures and just click the reset exposures button, but you can also sort by minimum exposure and maximum exposure. I would say check on that. Another thing to check on is if you have stacking rules set, or if you have minimum or maximum salary requirements. This is probably the most common cause here, actually thinking about it, would be a salary rule. So let's say, for example, that you are going into the last game of the night and you have a star. Let's say you have Curry in your lineup, right? And Curry is like 10,000 on DraftKings, and he's playing in the last game of the night, and he gets ruled out before lock. If you have a minimum salary set of $49,500, it might literally be impossible for that lineup to get rebuilt while using 49.5 salary, because Curry comes out. There's no player playing in the game that is high enough salary to match that. And now you can't rebuild the lineup. So I would say that would be another thing of like, honestly, if you're in a pinch, I would say turn this to 0. We're not going to build you a lineup that's that low on salary anyway, right? This is mostly kind of a backstop to avoid having low salary lineups. But if you're late swapping, you only have so much time, and you're getting errors, I would say this is another thing. Turn this to just turn this to 0 and put it there. I would say really all of this is to say is just let your settings float back to the default values, because you probably won't get errors on the default. Another thing to look at would be min uniques, right? There would be late swap opportunities, especially very late in a slate, where because of the limited players that are still available in the pool, it might not be possible to uphold a 3 minimum unique requirement on your swap, right? That would be another thing to look into, of maybe just turn this back down to 1. Again, most of your lineups are locked in. Turn it back to 1. So those are the kinds of things that I would say I would look at, is like, if you're really running into trouble, again, it can be kind of hard to triage that stuff and figure it out quickly. I would say relax some of your min and max exposures to certain players, turn your min salary down, turn your min uniques down, remove stacking rules. Crypto said, so even if an existing lineup is still the best after a late swap runs, it won't error out. So we won't necessarily, not every lineup changes when you late swap, and we won't error that out. If you're getting an error saying we can't build enough lineups, it literally means that there is a lineup that the builder is trying to change, probably because there is a player that is literally out, 0 projected, and it can't for some reason, because there's either a minimum exposure requirement in your set of lineups, or because of a min salary requirement, etc. But there will be lineups that we late swap that we actually don't touch because they are still the best lineup, and that won't throw an error. So if you're seeing an error when you late swap, it means because there's literally a restriction on the builder that is not allowing a lineup that needs to be swapped to swap. So another thing to try too is to, depending on what your error is to just go back to the entry editor here and just start with a fresh entries file from DraftKings. Download template file, select file, and upload it. But all right, cool. All right. I see this question here from RC Bremen here. I know you just got here, so this will be the last question of today. How do you do the ownership percent per player? So I assume you're talking about our ownership projections here, which are what we are projecting is going to be the percentage of lineups that have that player in it in a large field GPP, big contest, right? What we do for these is, that tooltip sucks. That is not descriptive at all. I just noticed that. The ownership used to build your lineups. But anyway, what we do to build these is we take a somewhat aggregated projection for a player based on kind of what we think the field perceives. All right, I think I'm back. Sorry about that. My internet blipped here. I'm not sure where I cut off. I'll kind of re-explain. We take an average projection here, an aggregate projection from what we think the field is going to project that player. We build thousands of lineups at a very high variance setting, and the exposure to each individual player we get in that set of lineups becomes our ownership projection. So in effect, we are kind of simulating the slate, building real lineups that we think are playable, and how often certain players show up in that set of lineups becomes the ownership projections. So what's really valuable about this is that it is using real lineups. We're using real lineups to project that ownership. So like there are certain times where maybe a player doesn't project all that well, but they fit in and they have the right positional eligibility to become very playable by players, right? A more hand hand-built approach to ownership won't pick up on that kind of thing. So I think that's super valuable. There was a question here also the other day, or actually yesterday, about like our projection method for turbo slates and showdowns and like night slates. We do it all the same way. So I think, we have ownership projections that I think are very accurate for turbos and showdowns and night slates and things like that. This also all happens kind of automatically. We will rebuild ownership when we resim our games, so we can get up-to-date ownership very easily. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there today. Thank you guys, everybody that tuned in here. Watch live, ask questions, left comments, everything like that. Of course, thank you to everybody that will be watching this video as a recording as well. Appreciate you just as much. I will be back here again tomorrow, 2 p.m. Eastern, but we're doing a live strategy session on NHL DFS. So let me know of any NHL questions you have in the Office Hours channel in Slack before tomorrow. Come tune in, ask any questions you have about hockey live tomorrow, and I will see you guys all then. In the meantime, enjoy this 11-game NBA slate tonight, and take care. See ya.